As we're going through the Bible, book by book and chapter by chapter, we're in Numbers chapter 1. Now, what's going to happen in the book of Numbers is it's titled that way because there's going to be a few times throughout this book where you're going to see the children of Israel numbered in some way or counted in some way. And there's a big temptation when we get into books like this where we see lists of people and numbers of people. There's a big temptation to just kind of skip over these sections. And while I'm not saying that there is some important spiritual significance in the numbering here, in the numbers of the Israelites, for instance, you can look through this list in chapter 1, and you can see that the descendants of Simeon are 59,300. Is there some great special spiritual significance in that number, 59,300? I can't find it. Maybe there is, but I can't find it. And so the significance here in this chapter isn't in the numbers that are present, but there are other things in the text that should be important to us. For instance, one of the biggest problems that we face in our country today is male spiritual leadership, or even really just male leadership in general. But when you look through Numbers chapter 1, who was counted? Now remember, this isn't counting value or worth in the sight of God. This is counting leadership and strength in the sight of God. But who is numbered? Well, first of all, there are men from each one of the 12 tribes who are going to be chosen, excluding Levi, as we'll see in just a minute. But they're called from the community, these men, and they're to go through and they're to count all of the males, one by one, who are 20 years old or more, by their military divisions or by their ability to serve in the military. And so what God is doing is God is going through his people and he's numbering out the spiritual warriors, or he's numbering out the physical warriors in this case. When we apply these things in a spiritual way, we want men who are going to be spiritual warriors. We want men who are going to storm the gates of hell and attack Satan, who are going to stand up for what is right, who are going to preach the gospel and teach the spiritual truths that God has given us. When we look through this, that's what a man is. A man is somebody who's going to stand up and who's going to fight. Now, we're not saying that people who are physically unable to fight in the Lord's army, or people who are too young or who are too feeble are not important or are no longer men. But principally speaking, when we talk about the principal definition of what a man is, it's somebody who stands up for what is right. It's somebody who fights against wrong and injustice and unmercifulness. It's somebody who fights against oppression. It's somebody who seeks for what is best for others. And they stand up. And if necessary, in the gap for other people, they are willing to stand up and fight for other people. A man should be willing to stand up and fight for his family, to defend his children, to defend his wife. And in particular, when it comes to spirituality, we need to stand up as men in this country, as men across the world, for what is right. There's this idea that has been passing throughout time that Christians have to be nice, we have to be calm, we can never get angry, we can never fight for what is right. We just kind of have to sit back and let everything, go along as it is. We just have to be kind. That's not what you see. That's not what you see in the Old Testament or the New Testament when it comes to being a man. Now, I'm not saying you have to be a jerk or you have to go and you have to punch people in the face when they say bad things about the Lord, but you do have to stand up for what is right. You do have to be willing to talk at the very least. You do have to be willing to be numbered amongst those who fight for the Lord. In Ephesians chapter 6, where there's that armor of God. Well, who wears armor? Well, soldiers wear armor. And in a manner of speaking, everybody who becomes a saint becomes a soldier for the cross, or a soldier for Christ. But we're looking in particular here at the numbering of the men and how that directly and absolutely impacts upon God's overarching principal design of male leadership, physically and spiritually. But I really want to focus on that spiritual leadership. Who's supposed to teach their children? Men are. Who's supposed to guide their family in the instructions of godliness and holiness? Men are. Ultimately, whose responsibility is it if their family fails in that regard? Well, granted that everybody has their freedom of choice, but ultimately the responsibility, if that instruction never happens, if that building up, if that encouragement daily of your family to serve the Lord doesn't take place, that's the man's fault. That's his responsibility. And when men fail to do that, that would be a sin. Just like if these men are numbered in Numbers chapter 1, when the first battle comes, when they say, well, I really don't want to fight. I know that I'm able. I know that God has done all these things, that he's called me out for his service. I know that I can do this, but I just don't want to. That would be a sin. It would be wrong for them to do that. It's wrong for us not to fight spiritually. It's wrong for us not to stand up for what is right, not to teach our children, not to preach the gospel. We have to do that. We have to do that. There's no excuse. And so as we're reading through these chapters, we need to focus on these lessons that we can learn spiritually. Don't get thrown off by the numbers. The numbers were important for the people at the time. They're not necessarily so important for us today. The important thing that we need to focus on is the spiritual lessons we're being taught. And we need to be warriors for God. We need to be warriors for Christ. We need to stand up for what is right. As we're going through the Bible book by book and chapter by chapter, this is Numbers chapter 1.